On this edition of Independent Sources, what's next for Haiti after protesters virtually shut down the country in anger over recent election results?
Endangered languages, why is it so important to preserve them?
And the uproar over Tainos claiming their ethnic identity.
We often hear news of animals being endangered, yet don't hear much about the death of languages. One study says that one language falls out of use once every 2 weeks. Scientists attribute this to a bilingual society or indigenous tongues disappearing in mainstream school systems.
It's also apparent in immigrant communities where second generations don't use their language. It's estimated that about 800 languages are spoken in New York, ranging from the Istro-Romanian Romance dialect to Quechua, named after the Peruvian tribe who speak it.
With all these languages spoken, some scientists are jumping at the chance to take advantage of this reverse Babel that New York seems to have become. I spoke with sociolinguist Miriam Cadillo and Professor Juliette Blevins of CUNY's Endangered Language Initiative to learn more about what's being done to preserve this endangered species. Thank you both for being here. Languages have come and gone extinct since the beginning of times, but the current rate of language extinction is said to be close to 90% of all the languages that there are around the world, and that's according to the Endangered Language Alliance, for which you, Juliette, work. Is globalization the main culprit here?
Well, I think there's a very large variety of factors, but globalization is certainly one factor. Right now, the estimate is that there are approximately 6,800 languages spoken in the world, and of those, in about 100 years, maybe half will still be spoken. So what we're seeing is the major world languages, that's Mandarin, Chinese, English, Spanish, Russian, and so on, the top 10 to 15 are actually taking over the globe. And globalization plays a big role because people are bombarded with media and listening on their, devices, handheld devices to these major world languages.
Miriam, what do you find to be the main causes to this rate of extinction?
Well, I think it is, there are macro reasons and also micro, no? It depends. On one, you have what the professor has just mentioned, which is sort of things that are happening globally. But then you also have the language policies on each country and each region, who have always been pushing for homogenization of some of the languages over other languages. And the ones that are usually have been more impacted have been the languages of the poor, the languages of the indigenous people, or the tribal people of the world. And also the Creoles. Huh? I mean, there is an impact on those languages.
Are there certain parts of the world more affected than others, Miriam?
Well, that will be a matter of criteria. But what I can report to is about what is happening in South America, especially in the Andes and in the Amazon. That we have a number of languages, especially in the Amazon areas of Peru, that are basically at the birth of extinction. And revitalization efforts are urgent in those areas. And even Quechua, who is supposed to be a language that apparently has a lot of vitality, around 12 to 14 million people speak Quechua in 7 countries in South America, is an endangered language too.
And how do you go about revitalizing a language? If you could, Miriam, talk about your personal involvement in Peru.
Well, revitalizing a language depends to me a lot on the speakers themselves. The speakers are the ones who have to make the decision to keep on, first of all, using the language and giving it to their children. If there is an interruption in the what we call intergenerational, that's a concept that Dr. Joshua Fishman has created. If there is an interruption, then the language will go anyway. And then the second thing is to try to look at how countries can make some decisions that are usually called from top down, which is legislation. I have worked, I am not, as a sociolinguist, I'm not a great believer in those kind of initiatives, but I had the opportunity to work in the drafting of a legislation in Peru that was approved, and that it should be important in terms of helping preserving, oral, original, and indigenous languages in Peru. But legislation is something very complicated. Sometimes it works in the opposite way. Then there are the changes that come from the same people. Bilingual teachers, I think, at least in the Andes, are probably the most important group in this moment, because they are the ones who have the children who are still speaking the mother tongue, or in indigenous language as a mother tongue, and they are the ones who reformulate the policy, the ones who try to keep the languages alive. So.
I'd like to focus our attention on New York City, where about 900 languages are spoken, and about half of those are said to be endangered. Juliet, how are linguists tapping into this pool of endangered languages, and how does it help to revitalize some of them?
Well, what linguists are doing at the moment are, first of all, we're trying to get accurate survey numbers. So we have some numbers from the U.S. Census and the New York State Census. We're trying to improve on those by sending linguistics students and other interested language activists out to the streets in places like Queens and Brooklyn, where there's a lot of linguistic diversity, to publicize the fact that there are linguists here who are willing to help people if they're interested in revitalizing their language or maintaining their language. And we've had a lot of positive responses from groups, immigrant groups from all over the world, groups from the Middle East, from China, from West Africa. In Brooklyn, there are many speakers of endangered languages from the Caucasus region. As Miriam said, I mean, it is up to the speakers to decide what they want to do with their language. But what's interesting about the New York City situation is that many groups, like the Garifuna that you mentioned earlier, they have critical masses of people here in the city, and they are maintaining their culture. They have weekly or bi-weekly meetings where they can get together and talk.
And how can a language like Austro-Romanian, found in Queens, but only a few people speak it, and the chances are that their children are not speaking it, or if they marry people who are American, the chances of perpetuating the language to the next generations are very slim. How do you maintain that language?
Well, in that case, there have been efforts by a linguist and others at NYU creating actually a website of Vlaški, the language, where there are learning and teaching materials available. And for a very small, dispersed community like that, the internet, which often speeds up language extinction, can actually help to revitalize a language, because there are people all over the world now who are listening to the language through that website. So that's one tool that's being used.
Yes, Miriam?
Yeah, digital literacy is really, and media in general, is very well received by, for example, indigenous people in the Amazon and in the Andes. It looks like if there is a better connection between their oral tradition and this digital literacy, and because they're not going from oral to oral, but to a different kind of medium, it's more appealing than to basically do writing as we look at it in the classrooms. So it's very, very, very interesting to create websites. We have a lot of websites as Cyber Quechua. There are many things, and people are actually producing literacy.
And it can also help people stay connected to the homeland, because if they're very far away, they can hear the birds, they can see pictures, and they can, through that, revitalize the vocabulary that they might have lost from being far from home.
Yeah.
Juliet Blevins and Miriam Cadillo, thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.